I'll be your host for the day. I hope you're having a good morning. And because I see you have all kept time, I was expecting people to have a Kenyan timing signal, so I thought probably people will be coming in around 9:30. But since we're already here, I think it would be prudent to go straight to the first speaker of the day, and it's Ms. Mumbi Wachira, who's a lecturer at Strathmore University, with her presentation on finance sustainability. Karibu sana. A round of applause.
Faculty at Strathmore University, I have an accounting and finance background, and I was also very honored to feature in the upcoming podcast. I was invited by Sebastian to do this. And I think for me, sometimes people ask me, hey, but you're doing accounting, so how did you come to, the sustainability space? And I think the answer is in the podcast. I won't spoil the surprise. But mostly what fascinates me is just this idea of what does it mean for a business to be responsible? What does it mean for a business to think of its strategy from the point of view of how that strategy intersects with society and the environment? So that really is a big part of what I talk about day in, day out in different forums. But for today, I really want to focus on something which I think most of us are quite familiar with, which really is around the issue to do with how are we going to finance the Sustainable Development Goals. So we've set the aspirations. I think here, as I've listened to people introducing themselves, people are indeed experts around the challenges that are confronting the world today. But then what you realize, especially for Africa, not just Kenya, is that there's a financing gap. So there are the challenges on the table there, the poverty, the food security issues, the inequality issues, and they need to be resolved. It is quite clear in terms of, we're clear in what needs to be done, but then who is paying for this? So what we have been doing in the last, I think, 20, 30 years is looking to more developed countries to solve this problem. Okay, and they should, because even historically, as we know, there has been injustice in that front, right? But at the same time, we need to think about what are we going to do on the ground, what is possible here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, the upcoming conference, which we call COP, Conference of Parties. And this year, for the first time, it's in Africa. It's actually going to be in Egypt. I'm going to give a little bit of reflection around that. Then I'm going to go a little bit into why are we talking about finance as a route to achieving the SDGs? Because traditionally, what has been the role of finance, financial markets, financial institutions? Then we'll go into specific SDGs. So I was asked to focus on SDG 6, 7, and 9. And I'm just giving very simple ideas. In fact, I'm wondering if they're too simple, given people are quite experts here. Then I will close off, and we can have an interactive session where you ask me questions, because I really want to see what you think and also to learn from your experiences as well. So maybe we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So that's the simple agenda, describing the challenge, which I think we know about, but I'll try and bring in some different ways to think about them. And then what role the financial system plays, given its historical role in society. Then the focus on the SDGs, as I've mentioned, and then the optimistic outcome. So what do we hope to achieve from COP27? It's in Egypt, it's in our, it's in our region. So what is a hopeful outcome of this? What would we want? So next slide, please. The next one. So maybe we can just pause here. I usually, and I'll share this presentation out with all of you, but I usually show a heat map of the Earth. And that is taken from NASA's webpage. So they actually have a heat map of the Earth from the 1800s up until, I think now it's 2020 there. And what they show is how global temperatures have changed from the 1800s up until now. And what you see is that we move from a very blue, serene kind of surface temperature to a very literally red hot surface temperatures, yeah? And it is worst on the poles, the north and southern poles, but also when you look at our own continent, we're quite concerned with how the temperature changes. So whenever I talk about this in class, because most of the time I'm teaching MBA students, MDF, also BCom, yeah? Maybe we're talking about accounting, but I always put in these topics somehow. And they ask me, but so what? What's the problem? So it's hotter, so what does that mean? Then I tell them, it's okay if it's hotter, I don't mind it, but the problem is this thing, right? This is research done by the Africa Center. And you can see the effects there, okay? If we're talking about livestock displacement, we're talking about not being able to grow maize, actually. In the next 20 years, actually, it may not be feasible in some of our countries to actually grow maize, okay? We're talking about, the water levels rising, yeah? Coming into our coast, destroying properties along there. And actually, if you've traveled recently, or even if you haven't, if you just look at the Earth, and you can now use Google Earth, just look at Cote d'Ivoire, those West African countries along the coast, and look at the sea level rise, yeah? It's concerning. And someone would say, but what's the problem with that? The problem is that you end up displacing people. That causes a lot of tension now in society. And of course, it increases inequality and poverty. If you're thinking about, well, I don't want to dwell too much on this. I think we understand this problem. So there are several, yeah, extreme drought, extreme weather, unpredictable, patterns, of course, influencing society in profound ways. And of course, the healthcare challenges that come with that. Next slide, please. So that's the problem, yeah? So we then have this idea that was coming from 1987, and I think a lot of us are familiar with it, but it's really when people realized that there are limits to growth. So if you look historically at the time from the Industrial Revolution, again now I'm putting on my lecturer hat again, yeah? People like Adam Smith back then, these guys were talking about we need to increase productivity, yeah? We need to industrialize countries, and this is the path to development. So these guys wrote those theories, and they said, labor productivity, you need to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You need to increase the level of or the extent to which you industrialize economies. You need to produce at all costs. And people thought that the earth has infinite resources. It's only until the 70s when people said, hold on, there are limits. And there's actually a report called Limits to Growth, yeah, that was written actually before this conference in 1987. But that's the first time people started saying, hey, if the resources of the earth are limited, now what? What are you going to do? So people started talking about it. And by people, I mean these are Western countries. For us, we were going through our own things. Yeah? We were going through our colonialism. We're now free. We're trying to set up the country. We're trying to, be democratic. So we're not really looking at the issue. This was coming from the Western countries because they're the ones who were industrializing way back then. So that's when this term came. We need development that's sustainable. And we need to think about it in terms of not just present needs, not just our generation, but the generations to come. So when I was studying this, again, going back to that story I was telling you, accounting, finance, person, you're trying to write about sustainability issues, and you just don't know anything. And I remember one of my professors telling me, Mumbi, it's like a fridge. Let's say you go to your friend's place. I think many of us have done that. You go to house sit. And, they have left things in the fridge for you. They tell you, you know what? You go. Just take whatever you like. And then after 2 weeks, just make sure the place looks okay and I'll come back. Now, there are different types of people. Some people will stay there, and we've been there. You eat everything in the fridge and you leave it empty. Yeah? So your friend comes, there's nothing. There's someone else who will say, okay, they find things in the fridge, they eat them, but they replace it with different things, maybe even cheaper things. So maybe you found sausages, now you replace with, I don't know, there's no meat, but maybe you put something else in there, yeah? Some, cheaper sources of protein. Maybe you buy them beans, still protein. Someone else will be like, let me return what I found to them the best I can. So in as much as possible, they'll really try to add, to leave it the way they found it. And there are some who will add even more than they found it. And those ideas, those behaviors are things we call weak sustainability and strong sustainability. So this has been the debate, and it's still the debate. When we're talking about sustainable development for future generations, how are we going to leave it? How are we going to leave the earth for the ones who are coming after us? And that has been the discussion. Up until now, we're in the 27th conference now, trying to decide this thing. Yeah, really it boils down to that. What do we want to leave? How do we want to live now? And what do we want to leave for those who are coming? And this is where Sharm el-Sheikh, has potential, but of course there are many challenges. Next slide, please. Thank you. So of course, these are the challenges. I think we know them, but sometimes I find this model a good one because it's important to think about the challenges from what we call, the planetary boundaries. Yeah, in terms of if we're thinking about the integrity of the ozone layer, the biosphere, for example, where is the cutoff point when we really start to struggle with this thing? Yeah. If it is freshwater use, what are the risks there? What are the challenges there? If it's the ocean acidification, and those areas where you see that we are going towards the red, means these are the areas that we really need urgent action in. So for example, genetic diversity. A lot of species are being lost now. Yeah, in the last 20, 30 years, we've seen a lot of loss of different species, and we don't know what the repercussions of that are, but they will be there. If we're thinking of, just the type of, even climate change is a huge one, but I won't spend too much time on this, but that just helps us understand, when we're talking about challenges, we must understand them in terms of the boundaries and where we seem to be really, really in trouble. Next slide, thank you. Social boundaries as well, yeah? And by the way, I usually say this one depends on where you are. Yeah? It depends on which countries you are in. But for us, we know in Kenya what is really eating us at the moment. Yeah? These are the ones, the food security, the inequality, the healthcare. COVID has shown us the inequality there. And by the way, whenever we think about these challenges, maybe we could go to the next slide as well. It's important that we don't think of these SDGs like they are separate, because they are highly interconnected. Yeah? Someone has talked about forestry. I've heard it from more than one person. And you may just think, forestry. So sometimes you tell people, so forestry, which SDG are you talking about? Then they'll quickly tell you, life on land. And I'm like, okay. And the more you think about it, you realize, by the way, that life on land can impact so many other SDGs. It can impact poverty. It can even impact food security, because once you realize that you can actually commercialize forestry, not that you're cutting trees down, but you can actually engage in what we call carbon markets. And this is an income flow to the community because they are maintaining certain trees. Then you realize that, wait, this now touches on poverty, it touches on decent work, it touches on, several more. The other thing is, when you think about the SDGs, remember that sometimes there may be some tensions between them. And I don't want to get too academic about it either. But there could be some tensions. Sometimes you find that even as an individual, you listen to the podcast, sometimes, I struggle as an individual myself, even just with my own commitments and what I want to focus on. I look at them and I'll be like, what really counts now for Mumbi as an individual? Yeah. And of course, my instinct will lean on 10, it will lean on 5. But then I also know, maybe that's also a very privileged position. Maybe at this point in time, my community, my direct community needs me to focus more on the security issues of food or poverty. So sometimes there are tensions between them. Next slide. So now we're getting into the financial system. Yeah. So what, why are we saying this role is important? Yeah. We can go to the next one. You see, there's a financing gap. Now, going back to 1987, when these guys are meeting at that conference where they say, hey, sustainable development means this. All of a sudden, people say, hey, then we need to have certain goals. We need to actually find out how we are going to ensure that the world is stable, that not all the resources are used up. We need to address poverty. We need to address healthcare. So people start having those conversations. But then the problem is, and even before that problem, they are meeting at a governmental level. So different countries start committing, Like the Netherlands say, we're going to make sure that we cut emissions by this. We're going to make sure that we do this. We contribute here and do that and that and that. And that's what they keep having. Every year they keep having these discussions. But what this graph is trying to show us is that, you see, there's the warming level. It's escalating, yeah? And as I said, it's okay if it escalates. The problem is that it causes climate change. And that's where the problems of the extreme weather and so on come. So this is escalating. The pledges made to reduce it are much lower than what is needed to actually rapidly lower that global warming. So there's a gap. And initially people thought, this is a responsibility of government. Most of us here have had one person or two representing government, and government is a crucial voice. But it's not the only voice, because people realize that, hold on, businesses actually have a huge part to play in this. And that's where now people started looking at where else can we get the money to finance this, to close this gap. Because as you can see, the gap, it keeps increasing over time up until the latest projection, which is 2100, will be gone, yeah, unless you are, discovered the key to immortality. But what are we living in 2100? Yeah, I don't know what kind of world that would be at the extreme poles. And remember, the challenge with this thing is that once the effects continue, it gets to a certain threshold, then they're irreversible. Yeah. So you wonder, what kind of earth is that? Next slide, please. Here I just wanted to take us back into, when you talk about the role of this system, when I was learning the little economics I did, and I think there are people here who have also done way more than I have, we were taught this. There's a circular flow of goods in the economy. Yeah, so you have these parties. You have households, which is us, yeah, just societies living in different structures, and then you have firms. So there's a constant exchange, yeah, of goods and services going between that. So the firms give us the goods and services, and in turn we give them labor, productivity, and so on. And that's how we have been taught economics for years. I would even say maybe even centuries, if we go back to the time of Adam Smith. Yeah? So this is what has been happening. But the reality is what? Next slide. It's not that simple. Yeah? It's not just that we just have value, the creation of value, which is really what this diagram shows, purely in terms of what is monetary. There's some things that cannot be easily priced, and this is what we call the externalities. So the fact that me as a woman, yeah, if I am married and I am a stay-at-home mom taking care of my kids, there's a whole debate about how should that be, monetized. Should my husband pay me a salary for doing that? But then it's your responsibility, you're a mother, But then it's work, right? And according to economics, that labor should be priced. But it isn't priced, so that's a problem. That's what we call the unpaid care economy. Another thing is that we're assuming the resources that the farms use for production, the extraction, all that the effect of that extraction is also not priced. We're not factoring in the way the natural resources are going in and out of that cycle. And we're not understanding that, again, these resources are not infinite, they're actually limited. So it means that, very simply put, there are many things, there are many externalities that we are not pricing. And that then means that, is our financial system actually adequate? Are we actually able to assign monetary value to different resources in a way that will make us understand whether indeed there's a value creation process happening here? Okay, so the next slide. How then can we think of the financial system here in helping us think through our economic, social, and environmental goals? Especially because, as I've just said, the social and environmental ones are very hard to price, okay? So, next slide, please. Just to go back, these are the functions of the financial system. The financial system is an allocator of capital, definitely, yeah? I think we know this. It's also a price, risk for trading and valuation. They help, the financial system helps to put a price on risk, yeah? Systemic risk, unsystematic risk, and also talks about issues to do with corporate governance. Now, what we have to do is to reimagine how can these different roles that they play also play a fundamental role in ensuring that we achieve the aims of sustainable development. So rather than asking, okay, the typical bank lending process, I have a business, I'm selling, yesterday we had students, they had a market, in school, I even bought a jeans jacket, yeah? So I have this business, I go to ABSA, I get a loan, and so on and so forth. Now, at what point does that change? If, for example, ABSA says, you know what, we're going to prioritize lending to businesses that have a social purpose. We're going to prioritize lending to businesses that are social enterprises, businesses that are trying to bring education into very low-income communities, or businesses that are trying to uplift communities by having them engage in different carbon markets. Then they give you a special interest rate for that. That's precisely what we're saying, that it's the same role, but now specifically focused on addressing the SDGs. And I don't think it's fair to say we should have them look at all the SDGs. What we're asking is, can they have a focus? So it's their core function, their core strategy as a financial institution. But then they look at it from the point of view of, apart from the financial return, what actually is the social impact of this particular loan we're making? Or if you're an investor, it's the same question, only you're looking at it now purely from an investing angle. Is this actually achieving impact? And that's what we call impact investing, or ESG investing, or ethical investing. Next slide. These are just examples, because now someone might be like, hey, she's so abstract, But just examples. What are those services, very broadly, that I just, was thinking about? And they are there. We know them. If we're talking about zero hunger or food security, yeah? What kind of, services do you have in place for smallholder farmers? Even insurers, I usually challenge them that, you guys, you're not actually thinking about your climate risk and the way climate risk affects smallholder farmers. You actually have models that can estimate climate risk for different types of smallholder farmers depending on the region they're in. And you can actually then offer affordable insurance services for these guys, so that we're not in this situation we're in where we are now in May, it's going into June, we're wondering where is rain. And trust me, farmers in different parts of the country are incredibly anxious about that situation. They don't have insurance on their yield. They've lost a lot. So what services, what buffers are available to them? And these things can be estimated. It's not that we have to reinvent the wheel to actually do this. The models are there. It's just changing the variables. If we're thinking about, I think people have talked about renewable energy, and I'll talk about it very quickly. But just, actually Africa's, the energy investment. In fact, I read a report recently that said we actually can achieve, our region is the one that can truly transition very easily to renewable sources of energy, just because of, first of all, our history, and because that many of our countries don't necessarily really rely on the fossil fuels, the coal, yeah? So it's actually quite easy for us to transition, but there's a financing gap. That's usually the problem. So these are just examples, and as I said, I'll share this for people to look at if it's interesting. Next slide, please. So when it comes to 6, 7, and 9, before I go, I was going to ask what is SDG 6, but I think we know. We know, it's okay. Clean water and sanitation. So look at these figures, right? We need 35 billion a year, yeah, to actually achieve this in our region. And that's worrying, because when you think about it, remember, I don't know whether we watched what happened last year in COP26. The developed countries said they have pledged 100 billion to least developed countries. Now, the least developed countries in this world are what? Africa, South America, parts of Asia, and just for 100 billion. And just for us, we need this 35 billion for one thing. So you can imagine just the extent of that gap, how big it is. North Africa needs even 4 billion per year, yeah? So what we need financing that can actually help, get water to especially the rural or impoverished communities, yeah? The ones especially who are outside the urban areas. So an example, next slide, is the work of a friend who I've met in a different conference called the Shared Value Africa Summit. And you should attend it because it's quite a good, I would say, conference. It's held yearly. And she is Rwandese, and she realized this problem that she looked at the community and she's like, these guys don't have access to water. It's a typical thing that we know. They're walking, long distances. It's not clean. It's not regular. So this came, she formed this business, Water Access Rwanda. And it's not the typical just, you can Google her, borehole thing. It's really smart systems, yeah, that can capture water and harness it for communities, not just for drinking, but for their farming as well and other things that they need it for. So this is what we're saying. We need our local financial institutions to channel funding towards these kind of businesses. And when we talk about, it's not that they should bear the entire risk. What we're trying to look for is, what are those, the way we say, innovative financial mechanisms? So there's this idea of blended finance, which is development financial institutions, like the IFC can give something, then the KCB's ABSAs also give something, so that some of the risk is buffered, yeah? Because also we have to recognize that our capital markets are not even that developed. If you're having 63 listed companies in a country as large as ours, we're not doing too well. Next slide. If it's affordable or clean energy, here I really thought, I think we know this. We know what needs to happen here, and I think I've talked about this already. But it's just realizing that if we can understand this thing about electrification, and understanding that, by the way, I think I even read that 24 countries out of all the countries in Africa have less than half of the people connected to a grid, yeah? So you can imagine there's a lot of opportunity there, and opportunities for investment in renewable energy solutions, yeah? So it's thinking about, even if you're thinking about it from a business lens, it's understanding that, these are some of the priority areas that potential impact investors, development finance institutions are very keen on if you are able to show a way in which it can reach many people, many communities, yeah, if you have a proof of concept, people are quite keen on this. Okay, next slide. The impetus of the ninth one is, how do we industrialize? So it's still leaning on that industrial revolution again from the 1800s, but how do we do it in a way that is resource efficient and is not harmful to people and society? What are those innovations? And of course, people look a lot at our manufacturing sector. Now, when I read the latest, there's an SDG readiness report that the Kenya Association of Manufacturers has made. And I felt that from a policy angle, without getting too much into it, we can do better. Yeah? What are those incentives that we're giving for companies, for SMEs, to, first of all, access regional and international markets, to invest in technology that increases efficiency, that's non-polluting? It's really difficult, but this is again, another opportunity that financial institutions, mostly the DFIs, I have to say, are looking into. Yeah. So if we could go to the next one as I'm closing. So what are the optimistic outcomes of all of this? Remember, COP27 is a way for us to secure some financing. And one of the things I was challenging my colleagues is, how comes we're not going to that conference? Even the Vice Chancellor, are you paying for us to go to COP27? How do you get our place there? Because our voices need to be there, yeah? And they are not so far. So these are I hope I'll go well, but these are the optimistic outcomes. One, if you could go to the next one, we can have a green recovery. Okay, it's actually possible and much less complicated for our region to actually have what we call a green recovery. Because if we are able to invest in the so-called green jobs, yeah? Recently, my friend here, Edna, talked about the circular economy. Yeah? There are lots of business opportunities there. And I think a lot of people have talked about that. I've realized a lot of people are in that space. So the thing is, can we then have ways of lobbying for more investment into these kind of jobs, into these kind of sectors for Africa and for Kenya, of course? Yeah, renewable energy is very promising, and I think we've seen that here. Okay, there are many success stories. So it's just saying we have shown you it can work. So are you then able, and it's profitable, it's viable. So are you then able to increase the pace of funding here? Next slide. We need upfront finance. So far, what we've been having is promises. We promised to give you 100 billion. Where is it? Yet COVID-19, I don't know how many trillions were deployed in the blink of an eye. And what people are not understanding is that these issues are very urgent. If we're actually not addressing them now, the ripple effect will cut across our borders and enter Europe, the US, and those developed markets. So it's making people understand that we need the upfront finance. We need private sector climate finance. So we usually talk about finance that goes into solutions and businesses that are looking at resilience. So how do we actually, ensure that people are able, we reduce the effects, of climate change, yeah? And we adapt to it, okay? That financing needs to come out actually quite quickly. And the more, if it can be blended, the better, yeah? Finally, I just wanted to end this with a quote that, of course, I've given very optimistic outcomes. I don't know how it's going to go, but really when we're thinking about financing, I keep thinking of what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said. She's the former New York representative. And she said, hope is not something that you have. In Kenya, you keep saying, hey, we just have hope, we just hope for the best, But you actually make it, and I've seen it practically. Yeah, you can't just sit there and say we pray for a better tomorrow. I think I'm a Christian also. I pray, but I also know God says, okay, then now go and do it because you can. So it's knowing that we are all playing a part, and if we can collaborate, then the better. So I'd like to stop there, and thank you so much for joining in this morning.